think we were in the finishing pages of Canto 5. I stopped somewhere at the bottom of page 101 by my edition. The line would be, the light began of the Trinity Supreme. All there discovered what it seeks for here. If you remember, we were discussing this question of the ascent and the descent, or the descent and the ascent, in the context of the creation or the manifestation. And all this is being experienced by Ashwapati. And there we see the phase that he reaches the precincts of the Trinity, or the what we call the Trinity Supreme. Of course, this is the very old Vedantic or the Vedic description. In its summit gleam, where night is not nor sleep, the light began of the Trinity Supreme. So these are the lines which reflect the Vedas, where it is described that that superconscient, at that level there is neither the night nor the darkness nor light. So it is that kind of a thing where they describe there is neither the sun nor the moon, neither creation. So it reflects some kind of a Vedic imagery. However, to come back to our experience of Ashwapati, so we see Ashwapati has not reached yet, but is on the way to the Trinity Supreme. And now we are going to get a description of what happens on that level. All there discovered what it seeks for here. Of course, whatever we are trying for, aspiring to, desiring for, all our attempts for perfection, all our aspirations, they're all fulfilled on that level of the Trinity Supreme. It freed the finite into boundlessness and rose into its own eternities. So here, of course, is very clear, it freed the finite. So all that is finite, limited, in ignorance, there on that level, on that superconscious level, the finite itself becomes boundless, is nearing its own infinitude, and rose into its own eternities. Yeah, what I was telling about the boundless and the eternal, that means we can see both the eternal and the infinite, both are included. So it's a kind of a fulfillment of this manifestation. Everything that is incomplete here gets its completion there, on that superconscious level. The idea and feeling groping in ignorance at last clutched passionately the body of truth. So the same idea, the idea and feeling, that is the mental and the vital aspirations, or the mental and the vital consciousness, here trying but not achieving, is groping in ignorance, find their ultimate, the body of truth, or they find their own ultimate realization on that level. Similarly, the music, born in matter's silences, plucked nude out of the ineffable's fathomlessness, the meaning it had held but could not voice. So similarly, what happens in matter? That means matter itself is a kind of an expression of the divine. But in that matter's silences plucked nude out of the ineffable's fathomlessness, in the depths of matter there is a music. A music means not the music that we think of it is not the music that comes into our ears. Music is a kind of a subtle expression of the infinite. So that subtle expression of the infinite is found in matter. That is also now released, because on that level everything gets complete, released, fulfilled. So even in matter that is there, embedded in matter, is now plucked out nude in the ineffable fathomlessness, and then it finds its own meaning, its own purpose, which it could not voice or tell on the lower level. So that's what we have seen. Mind, the vital and the physical are the matter. Now we come to the next line. The perfect rhythm now only sometimes dreamed, an answer brought to the torn earth's hungry need, rending the night that had concealed the unknown, giving to her her lost, forgotten soul. So here we have the perfect rhythm now only sometimes dreamed. Of course, whatever higher intuitions we get, higher realms of knowledge we get, our dreams get fulfilled only sometimes in some glimpse or in some little moments our dreams are fulfilled. An answer brought to the torn earth's hungry need. You see, what is this earth's hungry need? It's not just food, it's not just shelter, it's not just material thing. Earth is also hungry for truth, for peace, for ananda, for calmness. So it is there in the innate aspiration of the earth. So all these things are again fulfilled on that level or by the descent of the Trinity Supreme. Rending the night that had concealed the unknown, giving to her her lost, forgotten soul. You see, earth or the soul is lost in matter, is lost, is forgotten in ignorance. But again, with the touch of the Trinity Supreme, earth gets back her soul, gets back her meaning, and all its own inner meaning is revealed. A grand solution closed the long impasse in which the heights of mortal effort end. You see, there was a kind of a long impasse, there's a kind of a hindrance, that could not move out, that could not move on. So all that was blocking the earth, its soul from its evolution, now they find their own end, their own meaning, their own summit. A reconciling wisdom looked on life. This is a very fine phrase we see. A reconciling wisdom. A wisdom that is bringing in a kind of a synthesis, bringing in the sense of unity. So one of the things that we can see here is, what is wisdom? Of course, there are different ways of defining that, but I think this is a very beautiful definition here. Wisdom is one that unites, is one that synthesizes. It's knowledge that divides, but wisdom unites. So this is the basic characteristic of wisdom. So it's that kind of a reconciling wisdom that looked on life. It took the striving undertones of mind and took the confused refrain of human hopes and made of them a sweet and happy call. So now we see a little change in the description here, that we have till now seen an imagery or description of the Trinity Supreme, but then Sri Aurobindo shifts to another image brings in the question of wisdom. Now, I do not know philosophically if that can be equated with the supermind, because below the level of Satchitananda, there is the level of supermind. And this supermind's main characteristic is of unity. And that's why he calls it the reconciling wisdom. And it is this wisdom which is really took all the confused refrain of human hopes. We have all the confusion and the hopes that really get dashed, everything, but it puts them all together and makes a beautiful, happy call, means a happy, glad aspiration to the higher. So it is kind of synthesizing all things upon earth, good and bad, happy and sorrow, and giving them a new note, as if. So it lifted from an underground of pain the articulate murmur of our lives, and found for it a sense illimitable. It's the same meaning we get. That is, it is again the wisdom. It lifted from an underground of pain the inarticulate murmur. You see, we have always a murmur, a complaint. We have always some kind of a dissatisfaction, because we are based on pain. Whenever there is pain of separation, pain of physical, pain of the mental, pain of the emotional, immediately we get into a kind of a complaint, dissatisfaction. So this wisdom is going beyond this murmur of the pains, and then it goes and finds itself an illimitable sense. That means a higher realm, a higher meaning, and tells humanity as if that beyond your complaint, beyond your pain, there is a realm of peace and unity. A mighty oneness is perpetual theme. It caught the soul's faint, scattered utterances. You see, when we see this line, a mighty oneness is perpetual theme, this is precisely the theme of Sri Aurobindo's own philosophy. All the time he speaks of this mighty oneness, be it on the human level, human unity, or the unity with the divine, the inner integration. Everywhere, if you want to describe Sri Aurobindo as in one word, it is this mighty oneness. At all times we see the undercurrent theme of his philosophy is unity and oneness. Unity amongst multiplicity and oneness with the divinity. So we say this wisdom also is trying to bring about that mighty oneness in its perpetual theme. It caught the soul's faint, scattered utterances, read hardly twixt our lines of rigid thought, or mid this drowse and coma on matter's breast, heard like disjointed mutterings in sleep. You see, this is again a very beautiful image. It caught the soul's faint, scattered utterances. What are these soul's faint utterances? Once the mother had told me about this faint utterance. She didn't say it's the faint utterance, but the way she said, I feel it is the soul's utterance. When she described to me the common man's life, how he is born, he grows up, he gets educated, gets married, and how he goes, then she said, time to time in between, there's an utterance of the soul which says, Voilà je suis, here am I. But je suis, I'm here, look at me also. That Voilà je suis is that faint utterance of the soul. But she again described, we have no time to hear that faint, feeble, humble, sweet, soft utterance of the soul. So that's what I can imagine here when I see this line. It caught the soul's faint, scattered utterances, They had hardly twixt our lines of rigid thought. Yeah, these utterances, exactly as is describing here, we lose them, or we do not even hear these utterances because of our own rigidity of thought, because of our own vital and physical craving, or mid this drowse and coma on matter's breast, you see, the tamas of physical. So, and it is all translated as if it's disjointed mutterings in sleep. It's a very beautiful image. I think I'm recollecting quite concretely what the mother is saying. That you see, we brush it off saying it's a muttering in sleep. We don't give it importance. It's a faint thing that I've heard, but you say, no, maybe I've not heard it, maybe it's a disjointed muttering in sleep. Not to give it much importance, not to give it much credence, and then we move on. So the mind is against it, the vital, the physical, the tamas, and sometimes, as in some class you explain, that these mutterings or these faint scattered utterances of the soul, they repeat, and then they stop repeating. Because if you don't give it any kind of a credence and don't give it a kind of a value, a kind of a moment, and you say, yes, tell me what is it you want. You know, when we have a physical pain, we give it all the attention, we go do this, we do that, go to the doctor. But when there's a psychic pain, we don't look at it. We don't even bother to ask it, what is it that you really want? There's a mental anguish, you take all the care, you read the books, you go to meditation. When there's an emotional anguish, you try to bring it peace. But have we ever paid any attention to the psychic pain, to the inner pain? And I feel, and that the mother has explained, that when we sat in front of her, she didn't consult your mind, your emotions, your body, what they needed. She said, I used to penetrate through your eyes directly into your soul and ask the soul what is it that it wanted. See, our going to her was going to the divine scanner who would scan the psychic being's needs and necessities. So that's what is the pathetic sentence here, that heard like disjointed mutterings in sleep, and then it says, it grouped the golden links that they had lost and showed to them their divine unity, saving from the error of divided self the deep spiritual cry in all that is. See here, it is always, in this section is always the wisdom, which is grouping the golden links that they had lost. The golden links here may refer to the spiritual experiences that are scattered around in different philosophies, in different human beings. And you see, particularly the philosophies, they do not agree with each other. These philosophies quarrel, and then they say, my philosophy is this, your philosophy is different. So this wisdom, that's why I'm all the time thinking this wisdom must be connected to the supermind. Because the supermind, which has that reconciling power, which has that uniting strength. So even the philosophies, even these experiences, everything it puts together and then saving from the error of divided self. You see, we constantly are getting divided from each other. All these things, the wisdom is putting together. And then the deep spiritual cry in all that is. That is I noted here a line, I think, which I remembered long back, not now. In Virgil there is a line called, which says, a touch of tears in mortal things. I don't know what context I remembered. But the spiritual cry, the cry is the touch of tears in mortal things. I think it has sense. What Virgil is saying is that in everything mortal, there is a deep cry. Not cry that is, not a complaint, not a pain, but the cry is in the sense of the aspiration, something that is longing to exceed itself, longing for the higher. So this wisdom is also bringing out that deep spiritual cry in all things mortal, putting them into a kind of a unity and then showing them their own innate divinity. All the great words that toil to express the One were lifted into an absoluteness of light, an ever-burning revelation's fire, and the immortality of the eternal voice. This is very powerful. All the great words, W is capital, that toil to express the One. Obviously, that is the mantra. Is these mantric words which are trying to capture, to express, to manifest the Supreme One, were lifted into an absoluteness of light and ever-burning revelation's fire. Beautiful. Revelation, again, R is capital. Revelation of the Supreme Mystery or the Supreme Divinity. And the immortality of the eternal voice, these are all repeated from the point of view of idea. They are repeated in the sense that the wisdom puts together the immortality of eternal voice, is a revelation, is an absolute light, and the expressions of the One. It's all one word, is mantra. So these 4 lines are a wonderful definition of a mantra. It's the mantra that expresses the One. It's the mantra that lifts us to the absolute light. It's the mantra that brings in the revelation. It's the mantra that really connects us with that eternal voice. There was no quarrel more of truth with truth. The endless chapter of the differences retold in light by an omniscient scribe. Traveled through difference towards unity, mind's winding search lost every tinge of doubt. Led to its end by an all-seeing speech that guard the initial and original thought with the finality of an ultimate phrase. United were time's creative mood and tense to the style and syntax of identity. Now we come back to the first sentence. So, there was no quarrel more of truth and truth. Obviously, with this wisdom, with the supramental knowledge, pervading everywhere, there cannot be a difference, and then truth versus truth, it cannot be, because all truths are united. The endless chapter of the differences retold in light by an omniscient scribe. Yes, you see, all the differences that are there in human thought are retold, are put together in a unifying manner. And I can give you a perfect example, is the life divine. This life divine, Sri Aurobindo, the life divine, is that omniscient scribe, is Sri Aurobindo, who is putting together all the differences of thought and bringing about a great synthesis, where there is no quarrel between truth and truth. You see, that's a perfect example where different truths are handled, put together, but without any kind of a conflict, any kind of a quarrel, as it says. So life divine is that synthesis of different thoughts, and that's what maybe is a fine example of what this wisdom is doing. Travel through difference towards unity. Mind's winding search lost every tinge of doubt. So once there is a synthesis, then this usual doubting Thomas that is called mind, that is gone. Mind also begins to now understand, accept, bow down and say, yes, I accept the higher truths. Led to its end by an all-seeing speech that garbed the initial and original thought with the finality of an ultimate phrase. Yeah, this is the wisdom when it is uttering, expressing, that is the ultimate phrase, the ultimate utterance, wherein all the original thought, all the synthetic thought is there, unifying everything. So that's what the line tells us. United were time's creative mood and tense to the style and syntax of identity. Now we come to the next line. A paean swelled from the lost musing deeps, an anthem pealed to the triune ecstasies. Now there's a different description where suddenly we see Ashwapati is hearing a paean song, a song of praise, an anthem in praise of this triune ecstasies. Triune, of course, is the Satchitananda. A cry of the moments to the immortal's bliss. So he is hearing as if songs, universal songs on different levels, all of them rising as if in praise of Satchitananda, as if the strophes of a cosmic code, a hierarchy of climbing harmonies, people with voices and with visages aspired in a crescendo of the gods, from matter's abysses to the spirit's peaks. Beautiful line. See, now he's imagining, he's putting before us the image of a choir. So where there are different voices coming together, different harmonies, different, as he calls here, strophes of the cosmic code, and a crescendo of the gods, everywhere on each level, from matter to the level of the Supreme, every level is singing as is going up in a crescendo to reach the Supreme Lord, the Supreme Satchitananda. So from matter's abysses to the spirit's peaks, there were these great climbing harmonies. Above were the immortal's changeless seats, white chambers of dalliance with eternity, and the stupendous gates of the alone. Above, now, he's just crossing one more level. That means he has ascended, we have seen different levels. He has gone beyond the level of the gods, and now he comes face to face, not with the alone yet, but he says stupendous gates of the alone. He has come to the entry point of the Supreme alone. Across the unfolding of the seas of self appeared the deathless countries of the One. The One is the Supreme. So across the seas of the self, there are different levels, different waves, different oceans. From all these distances he crosses, Ashwapati crosses, and he comes to the deathless country of the One. A many miracle consciousness unrolled, vast aim and process and unfettered norms. A larger nature's great familiar roles. Affranchised from the net of earthly sense, calm continents of potency were glimpsed. Now that Ashwapati is affranchised, purified, released from all earthly bonds, earthly limitations, from the ego, what happens to him? He can experience these worlds of calm continents, homelands of beauty shut to human eyes, half seen at first through wonder's gleaming lids, surprise the vision with felicity. Sun belts of knowledge, moon belts of delight, stretched out in an ecstasy of widenesses beyond our indigent corporeal range. This is the lovely things. Once you are near the consciousness of the Supreme One or the Alone, you get experiences of different kinds. What is it? The calmness. Homelands of beauty, which are normally not visible to our human eyes, but he can see vast vistas of beauty. He can see what? half seen at first through wonder's gleaming lids, surprise the vision with felicity. So he is having great blissful visions which come to him because he is beyond into the world of the alone. And the most beautiful line, very powerful line, very poetic line, sun belts of knowledge, moon belts of delight. I think this is quite a unique coining of Sri Aurobindo's own word, moon belts and sun belts. And you see the way he has used, because sun is equated with knowledge. Sun is that consciousness, is that light. All the time we say is the light of knowledge. But then moon belts of delight. You see, at the moment you say moon belt, there's an experience, there's an impression of a kind of a quietness, coolness. So it is this delight which is not that exciting, vital joy. It is the delight which is calm, which is cool, which is soothing, which is, capturing you and making you into a kind of an ananda, I would say. So, Ashwapati is now wrapped in with this knowledge, in this delight, stretched out in an ecstasy of widenesses beyond our poor corporeal range. There he could enter, there a while abide. Who Ashwapati now is there in that range of the sun belts and the moon belts, a voyager upon uncharted routes, fronting the viewless danger of the unknown. This is typically of Sri Aurobindo himself, a voyager upon uncharted routes. Well, if you remember the line, you help me because I don't remember exactly. When he started writing Savitri, Sri Aurobindo told the mother, I have launched myself upon this uncharted routes, and he says, I do not know where it will lead me. I mean, this is not exact quotation, I forget the lines, but the mother told in the agenda, the Sri Aurobindo kind of told the mother that today I have launched on a rudderless ocean in a boat, I do not know where it is. Rudderless boat now. So, he is that voyager, really what he's saying, a voyager upon uncharted routes, fronting the viewless danger of the unknown, adventuring across enormous realms. He broke into another space and time. Yeah, that is typically Sri Aurobindo. He faces the viewless danger of the unknown because he doesn't know the path to the supermind. It is not a path that has been charted by anyone else born upon this earth since its beginning. It is absolutely new, unknown, untrodden upon, adventuring across enormous realms. He broke into another space and time. You see here, Ashwapati or Sri Aurobindo have come to the end of a journey wherein he catapults himself into another space. Another space is not that there is a subtle physical space or beyond this. It's a space and time beyond the lower hemisphere. You see, we have a space and time in the lower hemisphere of this manifestation, where we have the mind, the vital and the physical as the central figures. But then after this, after the mind and some of its levels, there begins the upper hemisphere. So when you go into that upper hemisphere, there is a completely new space and time. Space and time, they represent the characteristics of manifestation. The moment you hear the word space and time, it means he is still in manifestation. He has not gone beyond the manifestation. So now what we see is that Ashwapati is going to get into a different realm of manifestation, Because what we have seen till now in these three cantos, we have a few, I have made a little chart to tell you. That what has been the evolution, what has been the progress of Ashwapati, the adventure or the integral yoga that we said. I just made some notes here. You see, just to give you a kind of a wrap up of the three cantos that we studied. You see, in the third canto, which is called the Yoga of the Soul's Release, that title itself indicates that the very first step of Ashwapati was the psychicization. That means contacting the psychic. And that's very remarkable because the mother and Sri Aurobindo have indicated many a time that their yoga begins with the psychic contact, whereas most of the other old yogas end with the psychic contact. So here, typically as I said, Ashwapati's yoga also begins with the psychic contact. That's book Canto 3. And once it has a psychic contact, then gradually it is that psychic contact which diffuses or decreases your ego. So it is not the other way around that if I decrease ego, I get the psychic contact. On the contrary, because it's always in Sri Aurobindo is a positive, that means the inner contacts alone which can decrease the ego and not our efforts at decreasing the ego that will decrease it. You see, Sri Aurobindo always advised his sadhaks not to do the negative sadhana. You see, some people have written to Sri Aurobindo, there was a habit there, always having this negative approach of one's own weaknesses, saying that, oh Sri Aurobindo, I have got this problem, I have got this weakness, how do I get over this? He said, don't do that kind of a self-beating. It's a negative sadhana. Because if you're concentrated all the time on your defects and weaknesses and darknesses and imperfections, your consciousness itself will be engrossed with the darkness and the negativity. So on the contrary, he said, concentrate on the positive, on the light, on the divine aspect in you. Which will, if this room is full of darkness, what's the fun of saying, oh, this room is dark, there's no light, the current has gone, there's no use. If you keep on crying and complaining. Instead it says, bring a light into this, it's over. So all your 10,000 complaints will be over with one lamp of light here. So similarly it says, in our life, instead of complaining of all our problems, existential problems, physical, mental, vital, whatever human problems, he would say, bring the light. And that light is nothing but the psychic being. So typically in what he has advised, he does it himself. Of course, he advises because he has done it himself. It's the other way around. So the first step we see is the psychic contact, then the decrease of the ego or the vanishing of the ego. In fact, in one of the volumes I was reading, maybe volume number 35 of Collected Works, where he said long back he had lost the complete sense of egoism. He said there's only the physical ego now. Physical in the sense, not in the physical consciousness, but in the sense of the separateness. That he says, yes, my body means this is my body. The moment is just my, it is the sense of the ego, but it's a helpful ego. You cannot erase that physical ego of separation. So he says, except that little spot of physical ego, I have no ego. So that itself is a complete indicator that before that he has already connected with the psychic being, has merged with it, and psychic being has taken over his being. So that is the first lesson we see in Canto 3. And then because he has this egolessness and the psychic contact, what happens is that he loses his sense of separateness. Please remember, sense of individuality and the sense of separateness are two different things. You see, individuality is your true individual, your own psychic being and the Atman. But your separateness is what is brought in by ego. So here, having lost his separateness, he becomes cosmic now. So we have all descriptions where the cosmicity, or not the cosmicity, universality descends into that yogi called Ashwapati, or into the tapasvin called Sri Aurobindo. So what do we see? Psychicization, egolessness, and then the immense universality. Because once the ego is lost, you are connected with the universal. You are bound to become universal. It's not a question of your choice or liking or disliking. It's the individual is lost, the ego, the island ego merges with the main sea. So you become part of the sea, and no more an island ego. And once you are on the cosmic level, you become kind of a impersonal, because it is the individual which is personal, but the universality is impersonal. So the Ashwapati, the yogin, gains the status of the impersonal. So if you see in Sri Aurobindo, this aspect of the impersonal more dominant is because he used to constantly live in that universal consciousness, which he himself wrote saying, I am constantly living in the Brahman consciousness. So there is always the impersonal in him, and that is what is the essence of Canto 3. Now Canto 4 we don't get into much because it's a secret knowledge that was given to Ashwapati, and the first person upon earth to be given that ancient knowledge, ancient in the sense, primordial knowledge which was not given to anyone else. Now what's interesting is the Canto 5, Spirit's Freedom and Greatness, the one that we just completed. Now this question of Spirit's freedom, the title itself tells us that after the psychicization, universalization, then there is a step of the spiritualization. So this Canto 5 is nothing but an emphasis on spiritualization. You see, these are the 3 or 4 aspects of Sri Aurobindo's own yoga. There is a psychicization, spiritualization and supramentalization. We do not get into supramentalization as yet. But in these 3 cantos we see individualization, universalization, psychicization, universalization and spiritualization, which is the main thread of Canto 5. Now even in the stage of spiritualization there are steps. And what do we see these steps to be? That is Ashwapati, or the curtains of the mind are lifted up, that means he goes beyond the mind. He reaches a level that is above the mind, and that takes him immediately to a region called, where he sees the book of knowledge. That means it's called the book of knowledge, but it means the realm of knowledge. So beyond the mind, if we can go into this realm of knowledge or the silence of the mind, you do not have to think, you do not have to grope for knowledge. And that's again what Sri Aurobindo has given in his letters, that the whole of Bande Mataram, the whole of Arya, everything he wrote from a state of silence. So he hardly had to think. All these books that he's writing are not thought out. It is that realm of knowledge from where knowledge descended, as it is said, right into the fingers when he was typing on the typewriter. I mean, that is an incredible thing. It did not even pass through his mind, it passed straight into the fingers. So that's what the mother describes, that hardly he knew what he was going to write until the fingers typed out the words. He didn't even know what it was. So that was the direct transcription of that knowledge into the physical. And that is what we see in Ashwapati getting that book of knowledge. And in that realm of knowledge, he comes to know some of the inner secrets of this creation. That is, one of the secrets was what is what we call in our modern language memorandum of understanding between nature and soul. Between what we have a long passage where we see Prakriti and Purusha, where we see Purusha under the dominance of Prakriti. But that is what we call an agreement between soul and nature, where the soul agrees that it will work under the conditions of nature. What are the conditions? That the soul shall not reveal itself so soon, as long as nature is not ready. It's the same contract between the divine and nature also, where the divine says, I will work concealing myself in nature. So what does it mean? The soul or the divine or God concealing themselves in nature? It means the same thing. That is, that there has got to be an evolution of Prakriti, a maturation of the physical, the vital and the mental. So unless there is this evolution of these three levels of consciousness in nature, God shall not reveal himself. The psychic shall not reveal itself. As a stage in evolution, it's not in individuals. In individuals, yes, we can have the psychic realization even without the proper maturation of the physical vital. But as an evolutionary contract, God says, okay, I will bring about the psychic or the soul or the Superman only after the physical, the vital, the mental have expressed themselves exhaustively. And that is the contract between them, and that is the secret that Ashwapati finds out. And also Ashwapati gets to know some other secret, that what all we call fate, predetermination, it is not a blind law. There is, as he calls, a divine will. Even behind the so-called fate is the divine will which is acting, which apparently seems to be predetermination and will, and predetermination and fate, but actually it is the divine who is guiding us. So let us not be afraid of saying, oh, I'm fated to do this, it's my predetermination, I cannot help. Because always remember, there is on us the outstretched hand of God at all times. And Ashwapati now, having had this secret knowledge, he now understands that that this earth is imperfect. There's a lot to be done for this earth. It is so steeped in ignorance, and unfortunately, all success upon earth carry the seeds of failure. So nothing is successful forever, because there is a seed of ignorance in all our consciousness, in all our acts. And this seed of ignorance, sometime or the other, it grows up and it pulls down all your so-called successes. So Ashwapati realizes, until and unless we pull out that seed, that darkness of ignorance, earth can never have its success. So he realizes all that, and then what do we do what does he do when he realizes that the only way is to ascend further and bring down that infinite, bring down the Satchitananda. So with the pain for the earth, with the compassion for the earth, he says, earth can never be a home of the heavens until we pull out the dark seed, or the seed of darkness. And that's exactly what happens. The moment he wants to pull it out, there is the swing of the inconscient. There are passages where we see he's trying to rise himself into the upper hemisphere of the divine, and suddenly there's a thrashing by the infinite, by the inconscient. The inconscient which tries to pull him down, obstruct him, because it doesn't want Ashwapati to go further. And that is, of course, the typical integral yoga, that the higher you go, the deeper you plunge. So that is the problem which has been there in all the ancient yogas. That is, they never attempted to go very high in consciousness, because that would inevitably lead you to the lower consciousness. You see, there's always the swing up and then the swing down, and then the swing up and then the swing down. So one who wants to reach the Satchitananda is always has always to face with the lower consciousness. That's where the higher you go, all the lower elements burst, all the lower vital urges, they will burst, they obstruct you. Because that's the play, that nothing higher is allowed to settle forever. So we see Ashwapati going into the superconscient, but the inconscient grips him and stops him. So the struggle is always there, and Sri Aurobindo, it is only with the coming of the mother in 1920, after that he kind of readies himself to descend into the inconscient. Because to go into the inconscient, unless and until you have the power of the superconscient, the Shakti, you will be swept off. So even Sri Aurobindo did not attempt going into the inconscient unless and until the mother was with him, who was the incarnation of the divine energy and the Shakti. So when she returns, then only he dares the descent. And in the case of Ashwapati too, we see that it is there is a swinging of the inconscient. There he realizes the truth of death. He faces death face to face, and then he says, oh, after all, death is only a passage, is a process of life. So, and you see, as I was telling you, so once the inconscient has really blocked him, then there's the next ascent that begins, and in that next ascent we see there's a great moments of beautiful passages we have seen, where there is a descent of the might, of the ecstasy of sweetness, etc. And there's another positive phase in his life, in his ascent. And there's of course an in-between, a very strange passage, and strange in the sense we do not come across descriptions of this passage in his letters. It's only in Savitri I have found that. So that's why I call it a bit strange, because where Ashwapati comes across secret nature and an occult force on the borders of the earth. So this secret nature is not much described in the letters. So I'm not too sure, so we have to struggle there. What is this secret nature? However, the thing is, the secret nature reveals a lot of secrets of the inner being of the Prakriti, and ultimately all these powers of secret nature are laid at the service of Ashwapati. Maybe it's a kind of an occult level. You see, I'm expanding my understanding. That's what the mother had done. She had, Sri Aurobindo describes here the occult force, the realm of the occult force. So this is where the mother had conquered the occult forces, and these forces were the command and service of the mother. So this could be a hint as to what Ashwapati had himself come across, the secret nature and the occult forces. And ultimately we see once these occult forces are at his service, he has further ascent where he sees a kind of a panoramic view of the creation, the descent and the ascent, and all of them he sees are ending or climax, peak is the Trinity. So it's now very clear that he goes from one level to the other, he goes to the occult level, then he goes to the realm of the gods, and then he goes before the realm of the Satchitananda or the Trinity. And there we see the last passage that we did today, that before he enters the Trinity or the Satchitananda, he come across this reconciling wisdom or the level of supermind. So there he sees what are the effects of supermind upon this creation, all the things that we saw today, and after that, once he has the vision of the supermind, we have the last line, that he comes to the corridors of the Supreme alone, and there there's an abrupt stop where he says that he broke into a new space and time. So the journey of Ashwapati, we see how it started with the psychic realization and ends at the doorstep of the Supreme alone, or the One, or the Satchitananda. So basically, it is a constant ascent of consciousness. And in this ascent of consciousness, there are further details. The details that are given here are only a prelude or a foretaste of what is going to happen in Book 2, where we see immense descriptions, clear descriptions of the different worlds. So here in these 3 cantos we have seen his personal yoga. That's why I call it the integral yoga in Savitri. This is a personal yoga of Ashwapati. The psychicization, the universalization, the spiritualization, and then the realization of this Satchitananda. But when we come to Book 2, it is not the personal yoga aspect. It's more a description of the different worlds he comes across in his ascent from the universalization to the spiritualization, from the spiritualization to the supramentalization. So in this passage, what are the different worlds? It's not yet that he is supramentalized. It's not yet that he has transformed himself supramentally. He ascends into what we have said, the reconciling wisdom. he does ascend into the supermind. He does ascend beyond the supermind, where he comes across the Divine Mother. So these are graphic, first-hand description of a traveler of the world. Whereas 3, 4, 5 cantos have been an expression of his own personal yoga. So if you want to see Sri Aurobindo's personal yoga, it is these cantos 3, 4, 5 of book 1. And then book 2 is a traveler now. A traveler need not undergo this kind of a yoga just as I can go to America and see on the way what's happening. And then we come to the Ashwapati, to Savitri's yoga. So we have come to the end of a major section of Ashwapati's yoga.